Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe the channel. Enjoy the listening. My alien roommate tried human breeding for the first time. She requested me to share my bed. The moment Yen first stepped through the door of Mark's apartment, he knew life would never be the same. She wasn't just any alien, she was a Jorian, a race known across the interstellar community for their complex customs and unnervingly direct behavior. Mark was assigned to host Yen as part of a cultural exchange program designed to foster peace between species. He didn't have a choice in the matter. The notice was handed down with less than 48 hours of preparation. Your guest arrives on the 15th rotation. Do not offend. No instructions, no guidebook. Just the silent pressure of being humanity's ambassador to an alien. She stood there now, her tall frame subtly aglow under the dim apartment lights, her greenish skin faintly iridescent silver. Veins ran beneath the surface like an intricate road map. Her eyes, large and too still, shimmered with deep violet. Taking in the surroundings without expression, Mark couldn't tell what she was thinking. She turned her gaze to him. The intensity of her stare like a blade slicing through the stillness. Your environment is quaint, she murmured. Mark fumbled with the edge of his sleeve, trying not to stare at the way her elongated fingers flexed. Deliberate, graceful alien. It's small but comfortable, he said awkwardly. The bed's yours. Her eyes flicked to the bed and then back to him. Calculating, I do not require the entirety of it. Living with Yen was supposed to be temporary, just a month. But after 3 weeks, Mark felt like he was barely keeping his sanity. She was unnervingly precise, saying only what needed to be said, observing him as if he were some strange insect to be studied. And then it happened 3 days ago, to be exact, a conversation that left him reeling. The time has come, Yen had said one evening, her tone factual, emotionless. It is customary for me to engage in reproductive bonding during the exchange. It ensures cross-species understanding. You will assist me. At first, Mark thought it was a joke, but Jorian didn't have a sense of humor, at least not one humans could grasp. He blinked, stunned. What do you mean by reproductive bonding? I mean, surely there's been a mistake. Jaren tilted her head as though considering his question from every conceivable angle. There is no mistake. The silence stretched thin between them, and Mark felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest. I don't think humans do things that way, he stammered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the first hint of anything resembling frustration he seen from her. I am not human, and the process will not harm you. It is essential. Essential, that word echoed in his head long after she left the room tonight. Jaren made the request again. She was standing by the window, a silhouette sharp against the moonlight spilling into the apartment. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his palms sweating, pulse hammering against his rib cage. I require your cooperation tonight, she said quietly, as if it were a mundane matter. We will engage in the bonding process. Now Mark's breath hitched. He hadn't agreed, not explicitly, but he hadn't said no either. A part of him felt paralyzed by the sheer force of the situation, the alien customs, the pressure to comply. At his sense of agency. Why me? He whispered, more to himself than to her. I turned her expression inscrutable. Because you are here, and because I must. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate and predatory. Mark could see the fine scales along her collarbone shift as she moved, catching the light in subtle hues. Her proximity made his skin prickle, a strange mixture of fear and fascination crawling through him. The air in the room thickened with unspoken tension. Mark's mind raced with questions. Was this just a cultural expectation for her, a mere transaction? Or was there something more beneath the surface, a need she hadn't expressed, a vulnerability hidden beneath the cold exterior? His thoughts spiraled, and he found himself fixating on every small detail, the way her violet eyes seemed to reflect his every movement, the warmth radiating from her body, even though she stood a foot away, the strange, almost musical cadence of her breath. He could feel his heart drumming in his ears, a frantic rhythm that clashed with the eerie calm of her presence. Was she aware of how conflicted he felt? Did she care? Or was this just another step in the process, another box to check off on some alien list? Yeah, until Ed her head, slightly studying him with unnerving patience. Your heart rate is elevated, she observed. Is this a sign of consent? Marks swallowed hard, but not in his throat. Tightening. It's not that simple. She blinked slowly, as if digesting this new piece of information. It must be simple. There is no other way. He wanted to scream, to tell her that human intimacy wasn't just a biological function. It was tangled with emotions, expectations, fears. But the word stuck in his throat, trapped beneath layers of confusion and doubt. And then, without warning, Jiren reached out her hand, cool and smooth as river stone, brushed against his arm. The sensation jolted through him, electric, unexpected. You are frightened, she murmured almost to herself. That is unexpected. Mark stared at her, heart pounding in his chest. In that moment, he realized something unsettling. Yen didn't fully understand him. For all her intelligence, all her alien grace, she had no concept of the complexity swirling inside him, and that made her dangerous. The room was steeped in a heavy stillness, as if even the air refused to move. Mark remained on the bed's edge, his hands clutching the fabric of his sheets. In a white-knuckled grip, his mind whirred in a confused frenzy, trying to reconcile the reality of what Yen was asking with the human instinct screaming for self-preservation. She stood before him, serene and alien, her gaze unwavering. Everything about her, the eerie stillness, the way her skin caught the moonlight, the peculiar cadence of her words felt otherworldly. She wasn't threatening, not in the traditional sense, and yet her presence carried a quiet menace, an unrelenting will that refused to bend to human sensibilities. Mark's thoughts tangled into knots. How could she ask for something so intimate, so personal, with the same detachment she might use to request a glass of water? His skin tingled where she had touched him moments before, the sensation lingering like an imprint burned into his mind. It's just biology for her, he told himself. This isn't personal. But that didn't stop the fear called deep within his gut, and beneath the fear something else began to stir, something darker, a strange fascination. Mark shifted uncomfortably on the bed, his gaze flickering between Jen and the open door. Across the room, the idea of escape flitted through his mind, fleeting but persistent. But where would he go? She was a part of the program. Denying her quest could have serious consequences. What exactly happens? Mark asked, his voice thin and tight with her knees. Yen's expression remained placid, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, impatience. Perhaps we synchronize. Your body will adapt to mine. We exchange vital energies and establish understanding. The way she said it, clinical, devoid of emotion, sent a shiver down his spine. Understanding. It sounded more like an experiment than anything remotely intimate. And if I say no? He asked, knowing full well how dangerous the question was. Yen didn't answer immediately. She seemed to consider the question, tilting her head slightly, as if Mark were an interesting puzzle she had yet to solve. I would not force you. She paused, and her next words were softer, almost contemplative. But it would complicate things. I would not be able to complete my mission. The weight of her words sank into Mark's chest. Her, of course. This wasn't about him. It never was to her. He was just a means to an end. And yet, despite the cold logic behind her request, there was something unsettlingly intimate about the way she watched him, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the first move. Mark stood up abruptly, the sudden movement making lie and blink an oddly human gesture that momentarily broke her composed facade. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. His pulse hammered relentlessly, and his mouth was dry. I need space, he said, pacing to the other side of the room. I can't just jump into something like this. Yen's gaze followed him, unblinking. I have given you space, she said calmly. For 3 weeks. Her words hit him like a slap. She wasn't wrong. She had been patient, at least in her own way. But that didn't make the situation any easier to accept. It's different for us, Mark muttered, more to himself than to her. Humans don't just bond with someone because we're told to. There's emotion involved, trust, consent. The word hung Heavy in the air consent for the first time. Yan's expression shifted just slightly, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. You believe you do not consent, she said. Quietly, yet your body says otherwise. Mark froze. Her words slithered under his skin, making his heart skip a beat. What the hell is that supposed to mean? He whisked. Good. Yen took a step closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. Your pulse is elevated, your pupils dilate when you look at me. These are signs of arousal. Among your kind, they not. Mark's face burned, heat flooding his cheeks. That doesn't mean anything. That's just biology. It's not the same thing as consent. Yen studied him with an intensity that made his skin crew. Biology is the same across species, she said. Softly, that does not lie. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in around Mark like a vice. His thoughts swirled in chaotic loops. Fear, anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to desire. He hated that she was right in a way. His body had responded to her touch, despite the fear twisting in his gut, and that made it worse because it meant he couldn't trust himself. This is wrong, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This isn't how it's supposed to be. Jaren tilted her head. Again, expression unreadable. Perhaps not for your kind, she murmured, but for mine. This is the way of things. There is no shame in it. Mark clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something dark and dangerous, a place where fear and desire blurred together, where consent became a murky concept. Lost in translation, Yen took another step forward, closing the distance between them. You fear what you do not understand, she said softly, but there is no need for fear. We are not enemies, Mark. This is simply nature. Her hand brushed his arm again, and this time Mark didn't pull away. The touch was cool, soothing, like a balm against the storm raging inside him, and that terrified him more than anything else. He looked into her violet eyes and saw no malice, no cruelty, only a quiet determination and a kneeling knee to complete what she had started. And in that moment Mark realized something, why, and truly believed she was doing the right thing. His heart pounded in his chest, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. There was no easy way out of this, no clear path forward. He could refuse and risk offending her, jeopardizing the fragile peace between their species, or he could say yes and lose a piece of himself in the process. Mark sat back down on the bed, knees bouncing uncontrollably, his breath coming in shallow bursts, the air between him and why, and crackled with unspoken tension. She stood motionless, a violet eye shimmering in the dim light, watching him with an alien patience that both unnerved and captivated him. He wished he could retreat into silence, shut the world out, and pretend this wasn't happening, but there was no escaping Yen's presence, all the strange gravitational pull she exerted over him. Every second he spent in her proximity tucked him deeper into a labyrinth of conflicting emotions, each one more tangled than the last. If I do this, Mark said at last, his voice hoarse and uneven, I need to understand what happens next. I need to know I'll be safe. Yen's expression softened slightly, the corners of her mouth curving into something that might have been a smile or the closest approximation her species could manage. I will ensure your safety, she said quietly. You have my word. Her words should have reassured him, but instead they felt like a door creaking shut behind him. He sensed that once he stepped through this threshold there would be no going back. Yen approached slowly, giving Mark time to process her movements. Her presence was like a gentle wave lapping at the edges of his awareness, insistent but not forceful. When she sat beside him, the bed barely dipped under her weight, as though she carried more grace than mass. Mark tensed, expecting her to make some sudden decisive move, but she didn't. Instead, she simply sat there, close enough for him to feel the coolness radiating from her skin, but not touching him. This is unfamiliar to you, Jen murmured. I understand that fear cloud your thoughts. I feel it too. Her confession caught Mark off guard. You're afraid? He asked. Incredulous, she nodded, her gaze steady. Not of you, but of failure. My species does not experience fear as yours does, but we understand risk if we do not synchronize. My mission will fail, and I may never adapt fully to your world. Mark found himself staring at her in disbelief for the first time. Jen seemed almost vulnerable, not in a human way but enough to blur the lines between them. Was this manipulation, or was she truly laying herself bare in the only way she knew? How the thought stirred something unexpected in Mark, an ember of empathy glowing faintly amidst the confusion and fear. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jaren shifted her gaze, meeting his. "I need your trust." She reached out, then her hand hovering just above his. Mark stared at it, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. A choice lay before him: pull away and let fear win, or take the hand extended toward him and step into the unknown. His hand moved almost of its own accord, closing the distance between them. The moment their fingers touched, a strange current surged through him, not painful but not gentle either. It was like stepping into freezing water, the shock of it leaving him breathless. Yan's grip was firm but not demanding, her skin cool against his warmth, and with that simple touch, something shifted between them, an invisible thread binding them together, tenuous yet unbreakable. Mark's breath hitched, and Yan's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Your pulse is elevated again," she whispered. "Good, your body is preparing and not tightened in." Mark's stomach, preparing for what exactly? Yan's gaze didn't waver. For synchronization, the words hung heavy in the air, weighted with implications Mark couldn't fully grasp. He could feel something strange stirring beneath the surface of his skin, a tingling awareness, as if his senses were expanding beyond the limits of his body. It was unsettling, and yet not entirely unpleasant. Jaren shifted closer, her movement smooth and deliberate. Mark could feel the tension building between them like a still spring, ready to snap. The air grew thicker, charged with unspoken intent, every breath a struggle against the magnetic pole drawing them together. "Are you certain about this?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky. Jaren tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Are you?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Was he certain? Could anyone be certain about something like this? All he knew was that the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind was slowly giving way to something else, something that felt suspiciously like surrender. I's hand trailed up his arm, leaving a trail of cold fire in its wake. Her touch was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced, alien but not unwelcome. It was as if his body recognized something his mind couldn't yet comprehend. "This is happening." Mark closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. The bed shifted beneath him as Jaren moved closer, a cool breath gusting across his neck. "We are beginning," she whispered, and those 3 words sent a shiver down Mark's spine. The moment her skin pressed against his, the world tilted on its axis. A wave of sensations crashed over him, alien and familiar all at once, as if he were standing at the intersection of 2 worlds. His senses blurred, the lines between pleasure and fear dissolving into a haze of raw, unfiltered emotion. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, like standing on the edge of a precipice and knowing there was no way back. Yan's presence enveloped him, a touch weaving through his consciousness, like threads binding them together. He could feel her, not just her physical presence, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Mark felt himself slipping, losing the sense of where he ended and Yin began. Mark motionless, limbs heavy with exhaustion, his mind adrift between dream and reality. He could feel Yin's presence beside him, her cool skin against his own, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. The room felt surreal, as if time had slowed, trapping them in the delicate stillness that follows a storm. His heart still hammered from the encounter, his thoughts scattered like debris from a shipwreck. What had just happened was unlike anything he could have imagined. It was more than physical. It was emerging, an exchange of something intangible yet profoundly real. His senses still buzzed with an alien electricity, like echoes of Yen's touch reverberating through his body. He turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. Her violet eyes glowed softly in the dim light, their alien beauty unsettling yet strangely comforting. She wasn't human, could never be, but in that moment he felt more connected to her than he'd ever felt to anyone. "It is done, Yen," whispered her voice, low and steady, carrying a weight of completion. Mark swallowed hard, trying to form coherent words. "What happens now?" Yen's expression remained unreadable as she slid gracefully off the bed and stood, her movements fluid and inhumanly precise. "The synchronization was successful," she said. "You are altered now, and so am I." Mark sat up slowly, his muscles sore, but his mind sharper than ever. There was something different inside him, a faint, buzzing awareness at the edge of his consciousness. He could sense her presence even with his eyes closed, like a second heartbeat beating just out of sync with his own. He touched his chest, instinctively, as if expecting to feel something physically different. "What do you mean altered?" Jaren turned to him, a gaze steady. "Our connection has fused. Parts of our consciousness, a fragment of me lives within you now, just as a part of you resides within me. It was necessary for the synchronization to succeed." The weight of her words hit him hard. A part of her is inside me. The thought was as thrilling as it was terrifying. He wasn't just himself anymore. He was something new, something that existed in the space between human and alien. "I'll never be the same," he muttered half to himself. Yun's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Nor will I." Mark swung his legs off the bed, trying to ground himself in something tangible. His apartment looked the same, but it no longer felt like his own. The room was filled with the invisible presence of what had just transpired, a weight that hung heavy in the air. He turned to Yin, his minding. "So what now? Are you leaving?" Garen shook her head. "No, our bond is permanent. We are tied together, Mark, in ways that neither of us fully understands. To sever it would destroy us." Both her words landed like a blow. Permanent? He hadn't agreed to this, at least not consciously. Panic welled up in his chest, but it was tempered by an odd sense of calm, like a voice, not his own, whispering inside his mind, "You're not alone." Mark blinked, startled. "Did you just?" Jaren inclined her head slightly. "Yes, we can hear each other now, feel each other. This is what synchronization means. There will be no secrets between us." Mark's mind reeled. He could feel her emotions, faint but clear: curiosity, a hint of sadness, and something that felt suspiciously like hope. It was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of an ocean and realizing it stretched on forever. "How am I supposed to live like this?" he whispered. Yen took a step closer, a cool hand brushing against his. "You will adapt, just as I must." Mark's heart pounded as boy and leaned in closer, her violet eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "There's something you must understand," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "The connection we share is not merely emotional or mental, it is evolutionary." A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. "What do you mean, evolutionary?" Jan's expression grew solemn. "My kind cannot reproduce in the way humans do. We adapt by bonding with compatible life forms, blending DNA and consciousness to create something entirely new. What we did tonight was not just an exchange, it was the first step in creating a new species." Mark's breath caught in his throat. "A new species?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "You and I are the beginning. We are the prototype of what comes next." The weight of her words crushed him like a tidal wave. He hadn't just shared a bed with an alien, he become the father of a new evolutionary path. Yank hand lingered on his, her touch cool and grounding. "You have a choice," he whispered. "Embrace what we've become or fight it. But know this, the bond cannot be undone. The future we've started will unfold whether we wish it to or not." Mark sat in stand silence, his mind spinning with the enormity of what Yen had just revealed. The life he known was gone, replaced by something infinitely stranger and more terrifying. And yet beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something unexpected: curiosity, maybe even excitement. He was no longer just Mark, he was part of something bigger, something beyond human comprehension. Yen stood and extended her hand toward him. "Come," she said softly, "our journey is only beginning." Mark hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. Her cool fingers wrapped around his, and together they stepped toward the unknown. Two beings forever bound, their fates entwined in ways neither of them could fully understand. As they crossed the threshold of his apartment, Mark knew that his old life was over. Whatever lay ahead, it would be unlike anything he'd ever imagined, and for the first time in his life the unknown didn't feel like something to fear. The conclusion leaves Mark and Yen standing on the precipice of a new reality, one where they are no longer just human or alien, but something entirely new. Their bond transcends physicality, reshaping their identities and setting the stage for a future filled with uncertainty, transformation, and possibility. This ending blends suspense, fantasy, and introspection, leaving readers with lingering questions about identity, connection, and the nature of evolution.